The dynamic dimension is a function of the interplay of nature and nurture. It can vary from different levels of intensity of influence, such as high, fairly high, neutral, below average, and low on the dynamic self-actualization, dynamic egocentric, dynamic sociocentric, dynamic security, and dynamic complexity dimension. For example, we can interpret HDSA, code for high influence on self-actualization, FDSA, fairly high influence on self-actualization, EDSA, code for neutral influence on self-actualization, BDSA, below average or fairly low influence on self-actualization, and LDSA, low influence on dynamic self-actualization. Likewise, the same methodology can be applied to the other psychodynamic dimensions. One, dynamic self-actualization. These categories represent the varying level of influence of the dynamic dimension on an individual's self-actualization. High dynamic self-actualization indicates high influence. Fairly dynamic self-actualization suggests fairly high influence. Average dynamic self-actualization represents a neutral or average influence. Below average dynamic self-actualization implies a below average or fairly low influence. And low dynamic self-actualization signifies a low influence on self-actualization. 2. Dynamic egocentric. These categories can be used to interpret the influence of dynamic dimension on egocentric behavior. Similar to the self-actualization dimension, you can categorize the influence as high dynamic egocentric, fairly high dynamic egocentric, neutral dynamic egocentric, below average dynamic egocentric, and low dynamic egocentric. 3. Dynamic sociocentric. This dimension pertains to the influence of the dynamic dimension on sociocentric behavior. The categories are analogous: high influence on sociocentric, fairly high influence on sociocentric, neutral dynamic influence on sociocentric, below average influence on dynamic sociocentric, and low influence on dynamic sociocentric. 4. Dynamic security. These categories help assess the impact of dynamic dimension on security-seeking behavior. The interpretations are consistent. High influence on dynamic security, fairly high influence on dynamic security, neutral influence on dynamic security, below average influence on dynamic security, and low influence on dynamic security. 5. Dynamic complexity. This dimension evaluates the influence of the dynamic dimension on an individual's adaptability and complexity in behavior. The categories follow the same pattern. High influence on dynamic complexity. Fairly high influence on complexity dimension. Neutral influence on dynamic complexity. Below average influence on dynamic complexity. And low influence on dynamic complexity. By employing these categories, KAICO provides a structured framework for assessing how the interplay between nature and nurture influence various dimensions of human behavior and personality. This approach allows for a nuanced understanding of how external and internal factors contribute to an individual's behavior and adaptability in different contexts.